Sarah Miller stood behind the host's stand at the Golden Fork, one of Atlanta's most prestigious restaurants, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the polished wooden surface. At 42, she had spent nearly 15 years working her way up from a server to senior waitress, and she took immense pride in what she considered maintaining the restaurant's standards. The evening started like any other, with the usual crowd of well-dressed businesspeople and wealthy locals filing in for their dinner reservations. Sarah's lips would curve into a practiced smile as she greeted each guest, but those who paid close attention might notice how her smile changed depending on who walked through the door. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Peterson." Sarah's voice rang with genuine warmth as she welcomed a middle-aged white couple, regular customers who always left generous tips. "Your usual table is ready. Please follow me." The restaurant buzzed with activity, the gentle clink of silverware against fine china, the murmur of conversations, and the subtle background music creating the perfect ambience. The golden chandeliers cast a warm glow over the dark wooden tables and cream-colored walls, making everyone look their best. As Sarah returned to her position, she noticed a young black woman in business attire waiting to be seated. Despite the woman standing there for several minutes, Sarah busied herself with reorganizing already perfect menus and checking her phone, pretending not to notice. "Excuse me," the woman finally spoke up. "I have a reservation under Jessica Thompson." Sarah's response was cold and clipped. "One moment." She made a show of slowly checking the reservation book, flipping through pages unnecessarily. "I'm not seeing your reservation. Are you sure it was for today?" Jessica pulled out her phone, showing the confirmation email. "Yes, right here, 7:30 p.m. "Oh," Sarah replied, her tone suggesting she'd found something unpleasant. "There must have been a system error. We're fully booked tonight. Perhaps you'd like to try the casual dining restaurant down the street." Michael Chen, a new server who had been watching the interaction from nearby, felt his stomach twist. He had seen Sarah pull this routine before with other minority customers, but fear of losing his job kept him quiet. He knew the restaurant had several open tables. He had just finished setting them up himself. Jessica Thompson stood her ground, her professional demeanor never wavering. "I'd like to speak to a manager, please." Before Sarah could respond, Thomas Wright, the restaurant manager, emerged from his office. Having overheard the conversation, he quickly intervened. "Miss Thompson, welcome to the Golden Fork. I apologize for any confusion. Your reservation is right here in our system." He shot Sarah a stern look. "Please, allow me to show you to your table personally." Sarah's face flushed red as she watched them walk away. She justified her actions to herself, as she always did. In her mind, she was protecting the restaurant's image and atmosphere. She had grown up in a small town where such attitudes were common, and despite living in Atlanta for decades, some prejudices ran deep. Later that evening, during her break, Sarah sat in the employee lounge scrolling through social media on her phone. She came across a post from her daughter's private school, celebrating their students' achievements. Her daughter, Emma, was pictured standing next to her best friend, a young black girl named Keisha. Sarah felt that familiar discomfort she always experienced when seeing their friendship, though she would never admit her feelings to anyone. Michael approached her cautiously. "Sarah, what happened earlier with Ms. Thompson? It wasn't right." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Mind your own business, Michael. You're new here. You don't understand how things work. But the restaurant's policy clearly states." "I said mind your business," Sarah snapped, cutting him off. "Unless you want to find yourself looking for another job." Michael retreated, knowing he couldn't afford to lose this position. Sarah returned to her phone, pushing away the small voice in her head that whispered about the wrongness of her actions. She had convinced herself that she wasn't racist. She just had preferences about the type of clientele that should frequent the Golden Fork. Little did Sarah know, her actions that evening were setting in motion a chain of events that would force her to confront her deepest prejudices and transform her life in ways she could never imagine. The universe had a lesson planned for her, and it would arrive in the most unexpected way possible. A week passed since the incident with Jessica Thompson, and Sarah continued her usual routine at the Golden Fork. The autumn evening brought a cool breeze through Atlanta, and the restaurant was experiencing its typical Friday night rush. The dining room hummed with activity as servers weaved between tables, carrying steaming plates and expensive bottles of wine. At precisely 7:45 p.m., a man walked through the front door. Dr. James Harrison had just finished a grueling 12-hour surgery and decided to treat himself to dinner rather than face his empty apartment. He wore simple clothes, clean but casual jeans, a navy blue sweater, and comfortable walking shoes. His stethoscope was still hanging around his neck, forgotten in his exhaustion. Sarah looked up from her host's stand and immediately made her assessment. Her eyes traveled from his casual attire to his dark skin, and her lips tightened into a thin line. Dr. Harrison stood patiently, watching as she served 3 other parties who had arrived after him. "Excuse me," he said politely after 30 minutes of waiting. His voice was deep and gentle, carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from years of calming nervous patience. "I've been waiting for quite some time. Are there any tables available?" Sarah barely glanced at him. "Do you have a reservation?" "No, I don't. I just finished work and thought I'd stop by for dinner." "I'm sorry," Sarah replied, not sounding sorry at all. "We're fully booked for the evening. Perhaps you should try somewhere more." She paused deliberately, casual. Michael, who was passing by with a water pitcher, nearly dropped it. He could see at least 5 empty tables from where he stood. More troubling was the fact that he had just seated a walk-in couple who arrived after Dr. Harrison. Dr. Harrison noticed this too. His tired eyes took in the empty tables, the newly seated couple, and Sarah's dismissive expression. He'd experienced this treatment before, many times throughout his life, even after becoming one of Atlanta's most respected surgeons. Usually, he would simply leave and take his business elsewhere. Something about today, perhaps the exhaustion, perhaps the memory of saving a young child's life just hours ago, made him stay. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "I can see several empty tables from here. I understand if you're holding them for reservations, but I just watched you seat another walk-in couple. I would appreciate an honest explanation." Sarah's face flushed red. "Sir, I don't have to explain our seating policies to you. If you have a problem, you can take it up with management." "I intend to," Dr. Harrison replied, still maintaining his composure. "Could you please call your manager?" Before Sarah could respond, Thomas Wright emerged from the dining room. His eyes widened in recognition. "Dr. Harrison, what a pleasure to see you here." He rushed forward to shake the doctor's hand. "I can't thank you enough for what you did for my brother last month. That bypass surgery gave him a second chance at life." Sarah's mouth fell open slightly as she watched the interaction. Thomas turned to her, his expression darkening. "Sarah, why hasn't Dr. Harrison been seated? He's one of the most respected cardiothoracic surgeons in the Southeast." I didn't know," Sarah stammered, her face growing even redder. "Please, follow me, doctor," Thomas said, leading Dr. Harrison to one of the best tables in the house. "Your dinner is on the house tonight. It's the least we can do." As they walked away, Sarah stood frozen behind her podium. Michael approached her again, this time with more confidence. "You know, Sarah, that man probably saves lives every day. People like my grandmother, who had heart surgery last year. Makes you think about how wrong it is to judge people based on how they look." Sarah didn't respond. She felt a peculiar sensation in her chest, a mixture of shame and defensiveness. She tried to push away the feeling, to justify her actions as she always did, but something felt different this time. Little did she know, this encounter with Dr. Harrison was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself and others. As she watched Dr. Harrison being seated, she had no idea that in less than 48 hours, their paths would cross again under circumstances that would change her life forever. The following Sunday morning started normally for Sarah. She prepared breakfast for her teenage daughter Emma, attended church, and was planning a quiet afternoon at home. Her mind occasionally drifted to the incident with Dr. Harrison, but she pushed away any feelings of guilt, telling herself that she had only been doing her job. Around 2:30 p.m., Sarah's phone rang. It was her sister Jenny, and her voice was shaking. "Sarah, you need to come to Atlanta General Hospital right now. It's Mom. She collapsed during lunch at the senior center. They think it's her heart." The world seemed to tilt beneath Sarah's feet. Their mother, Patricia Anderson, had always been the pillar of their family, strong, healthy, and full of life at 68. The thought of her being ill enough to collapse was unthinkable. Sarah rushed to the hospital, her hands trembling as she parked her car. In the emergency room, she found Jenny pacing the waiting area, her mascara smeared from crying. "The doctors say Mom needs emergency surgery," Jenny explained, hugging her sister. "Something about blocked arteries. They're trying to contact the specialist on call, but he's out of town at a medical conference." Sarah sank into an uncomfortable plastic chair, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. Through the large windows, she could see the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the parking lot. The emergency room buzzed with activity, nurses rushing past, phones ringing, families waiting anxiously for news about their loved ones. A young resident doctor approached them, clipboard in hand. "Ms. Anderson's family?" When they nodded, he continued, "Your mother's condition is critical. She needs immediate bypass surgery, but our regular cardiac surgeon is unavailable. However, we've managed to contact our best specialist. He's on his way in despite it being his day off." Relief flooded through Sarah. "Thank God," she whispered, squeezing Jenny's hand. 30 minutes later, a familiar figure walked through the emergency room doors, and Sarah's heart nearly stopped. It was Dr. Harrison, the same man she had refused to serve at the Golden Fork less than 48 hours ago. He looked different now, dressed in hospital scrubs with a white coat over them, his manner professional and focused. Dr. Harrison approached the nurse's station, reviewed some charts, and then walked toward the waiting area. Sarah wanted to sink through the floor, but there was nowhere to hide. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice carrying the same gentle authority she remembered from the restaurant. "I'm Dr. James Harrison, Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery. I'll be performing your mother's operation." Jenny shook his hand gratefully, but Sarah couldn't move. Dr. Harrison's eyes met hers, and she saw recognition flash across his face. However, his professional demeanor never wavered. "Mrs. Miller," he acknowledged her with a slight nod before turning back to address both sisters. "Your mother has severe coronary artery blockage. She needs immediate triple bypass surgery. I understand this is frightening, but I want you to know that I've performed this procedure hundreds of times. I'll do everything in my power to help your mother." Sarah finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Thank you, Doctor." Dr. Harrison explained the procedure in detail, answering all of Jenny's questions with patience and clarity. Not once did he mention their previous encounter or treat Sarah with anything less than complete professionalism. As they watched him walk away to prepare for surgery, Jenny turned to Sarah. "We're so lucky to have him. I've heard he's the best heart surgeon in Atlanta. Some people at church call him the miracle worker." Sarah couldn't respond. She felt sick to her stomach, remembering how she had treated this man who now held their mother's life in his hands. The irony was almost too much to bear. A nurse approached them with consent forms to sign. As Sarah's pen hovered over the signature line, she realized with crushing clarity that the man she had deemed unworthy to eat at her restaurant was now the only person who could save her mother's life. The next few hours would be the longest of Sarah's life, filled with prayers, regrets, and the desperate hope that her prejudices wouldn't cost her mother her life. As Dr. Harrison operated on Patricia Anderson, Sarah began to understand that life had a way of teaching its most important lessons in the most unexpected and humbling ways. The hospital waiting room felt like a prison to Sarah and Jenny as the hours ticked by. The sisters sat in tense silence, watching other families come and go, while their mother's life hung in the balance. The institutional cream-colored walls and the steady hum of fluorescent lights created an atmosphere of suspended time. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about Dr. Harrison. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, both the calm, professional doctor who had spoken to them about their mother's surgery and the man she had deliberately ignored at her restaurant. The shame felt like a physical weight on her chest. "Jenny," Sarah whispered, breaking their long silence. "I need to tell you something." Before she could continue, a nurse hurried into the waiting room. "Dr. Harrison asked me to give you an update. The surgery is progressing well. Your mother is stable, but it will be another couple of hours before we're finished." Relief washed over both sisters. Jenny wiped tears from her eyes, but Sarah felt the guilt intensify. Their mother was surviving because of the very man she had discriminated against. "What were you going to tell me?" Jenny asked after the nurse left. Sarah took a deep breath. "Remember when I told you about that difficult customer at the restaurant Friday night?" She paused, her voice trembling. "It was Dr. Harrison. I refused to serve him because—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Jenny's expression changed from confusion to horror as understanding dawned. Sarah, please tell me you didn't. Not because he's... I did, Sarah admitted, tears finally breaking free. I treated him terribly. I made him wait, then told him we were full when we weren't. And now he's in there, saving Mom's life. Jenny moved away from her sister slightly, her face showing disappointment and anger. How could you, after everything Mom and Dad taught us about treating everyone with respect? After watching Emma grow up best friends with Keisha, have you learned nothing? Sarah couldn't answer. The truth was, she hadn't learned. She had held onto her prejudices like a security blanket, justifying them with excuses about maintaining standards and protecting the restaurant's image. As the hours passed, more hospital staff came and went. Sarah noticed how the medical team was diverse, people of different races and backgrounds working together seamlessly to save lives. She thought about how many families, like hers, had sat in the same waiting room, praying for their loved ones, not caring about the color of the doctor's skin, but only about their skill and dedication. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Dr. Harrison appeared in the waiting room, still in his surgical scrubs. Both sisters stood up immediately. The surgery was successful, he announced with a tired smile. We were able to bypass all 3 blocked arteries. Your mother is stable and being moved to recovery. She's not out of the woods yet, but I'm optimistic about her prospects. Jenny hugged him impulsively, thanking him through her tears. Sarah stood frozen, unable to speak, overcome with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and crushing shame. Dr. Harrison turned to Sarah, his eyes kind but penetrating. Mrs. Miller, would you like to see your mother? She'll be unconscious for several hours, but you can sit with her. Dr. Harrison, Sarah managed to say, her voice barely audible. Thank you. I don't deserve. He held up a hand, stopping her. Mrs. Miller, right now, the only thing that matters is your mother's recovery. We can discuss other matters another time. As they followed him to the recovery room, Sarah saw her mother lying peaceful but pale, connected to various machines. The steady beeping of the heart monitor, the heart that Dr. Harrison had just repaired, filled the room. I'll check on her again in an hour, Dr. Harrison said professionally. The nurses will be monitoring her closely. If you need anything, just press the call button. As he turned to leave, Sarah called out softly, Doctor. He paused at the door. Thank you for being a better person than I was. Dr. Harrison looked at her for a long moment. Mrs. Miller, in my line of work, I've learned that life has a way of teaching us the lessons we need to learn. Sometimes those lessons come at a heavy price. What matters is what we do with them afterward. With those words, he left the room, leaving Sarah to contemplate how a man she had deemed unworthy of basic respect had just shown her the true meaning of humanity and professional grace. Over the next few days, Patricia Anderson's recovery became Sarah's primary focus. She spent every possible moment at the hospital, taking time off from work to sit by her mother's bedside. The steady beeping of monitors and the gentle whoosh of medical equipment became the soundtrack to her days. Dr. Harrison made his rounds twice daily, checking on Patricia's progress with meticulous care. Each time he entered the room, Sarah felt the weight of her guilt grow heavier. She noticed how other patients and their families looked at him with admiration and gratitude, how the hospital staff respected him, and how he treated everyone, from the janitor to the chief of medicine, with equal kindness. On the 3rd day after the surgery, Patricia was strong enough to stay awake for longer periods. Sarah was arranging flowers in her mother's room when she overheard a conversation between her mother and Dr. Harrison during his morning rounds. Dr. Harrison, Patricia said, her voice still weak but clear, my daughters tell me you saved my life. I don't know how to thank you enough. No thanks needed, Mrs. Anderson. It's my privilege to help, he replied, checking her vital signs. Your recovery is progressing excellently. I'm particularly pleased with your heart rhythm. You know, Patricia continued, I taught elementary school for 40 years before retiring. I always told my students that what matters isn't what someone looks like, but what they do with their talents. You're living proof of that. Sarah, still standing by the window, felt tears spring to her eyes. Her mother had always been the moral compass of their family, teaching them values that Sarah had somehow lost along the way. Dr. Harrison smiled warmly at Patricia. Those are wise words, Mrs. Anderson, I had a teacher like you once, who encouraged me to become a doctor despite the obstacles I might face." Just then, a young black medical student entered the room. "Dr. Harrison, the Thompson case you mentioned? I studied it, and I have some questions if you have time." "Of course, David. Let's discuss it after rounds. Always time for learning," Dr. Harrison responded encouragingly. Sarah couldn't help but notice how his face lit up at the student's eagerness to learn. After they left, Patricia turned to Sarah. "What a remarkable man. We're blessed to have him as my doctor." Sarah sat down heavily in the chair beside her mother's bed. "Mom, there's something I need to tell you." Her voice trembled as she recounted the restaurant incident. Patricia's face showed deep disappointment as she listened. When Sarah finished, her mother was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, where did I go wrong?" she finally asked. "Your father and I raised you to see people's hearts, not their skin color." "I know, Mom," Sarah whispered. "I've been asking myself the same question. Watching Dr. Harrison these past few days, seeing how he treated me with nothing but professionalism and kindness despite what I did, it's made me realize how small-minded I've been." "It's never too late to change, sweetheart," Patricia said, reaching for her daughter's hand. "But change requires more than just feeling guilty. It requires action." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. A code blue was called, and they watched as Dr. Harrison ran past their room toward another patient in crisis. For the next 20 minutes, they could hear the medical team working frantically. Finally, things quieted down. Later that evening, Sarah saw Dr. Harrison sitting alone in the hospital cafeteria, looking exhausted. She realized he had probably been there for over 12 hours. After a moment's hesitation, she walked over to his table. "Dr. Harrison, may I join you?" He looked up and nodded, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "I heard about the emergency this afternoon," Sarah said quietly. "Did the patient?" "We lost him," Dr. Harrison replied, his fatigue evident. 38 years old, 2 young children. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, we can't save everyone." Sarah saw the genuine pain in his eyes, the weight of responsibility he carried. This man, whom she had deemed unworthy to sit in her restaurant, carried the burden of life and death every day. "Dr. Harrison, I need to properly apologize." He held up his hand, just as a new emergency was announced over the speakers. Without another word, he stood up and hurried away, leaving Sarah to realize that in his world, saving lives took precedence over her apology, as it should. A week after Patricia's surgery, Sarah found herself spending her lunch break in the hospital cafeteria. She wasn't there to visit her mother, who had been discharged the previous day, but rather to learn more about Dr. Harrison. What she discovered from the hospital staff changed her perspective forever. "Oh, Dr. Harrison," said Maria, a cafeteria worker who had been there for 20 years. "He buys lunch for families who can't afford it. Never wants anyone to know, but I've seen him do it countless times." Throughout the day, Sarah quietly observed and listened. She learned that Dr. Harrison ran a free clinic on weekends in one of Atlanta's poorest neighborhoods. He had established a foundation that provided scholarships to minority students pursuing medical careers. Every Christmas, he organized a toy drive for children in the cardiac ward. While sitting in the hospital lobby, Sarah overheard 2 nurses discussing a recent case. "Remember that homeless man last month?" One nurse said. "No insurance, severe heart condition. Dr. Harrison not only did the surgery for free, but also helped him get into a rehabilitation program." "That's just who he is," the other nurse replied. "Never turns anyone away, regardless of their ability to pay." Sarah's research led her to newspaper articles about Dr. Harrison. One story detailed how he had grown up in a poor neighborhood, raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs to support him. Despite facing discrimination and financial hardships, he had graduated top of his class from medical school. Later that afternoon, Sarah gathered her courage and knocked on Dr. Harrison's office door. His secretary had told her he usually took a short break between surgeries at this time. "Come in," his familiar voice called. The office was modest, with walls covered in medical certificates and children's drawings from grateful patients. Dr. Harrison sat at his desk, reviewing patient files. "Mrs. Miller," he said, looking up. "How is your mother doing at home?" "She's recovering well, thanks to you," Sarah replied, then took a deep breath. Dr. Harrison, I've spent the day learning about you, about everything you do for this community. It makes what I did at the restaurant even more shameful. He leaned back in his chair, studying her thoughtfully. Mrs. Miller, may I share something with you? Sarah nodded, sitting in the chair he indicated. When I was in medical school, he began, I had a professor who was a lot like you. He didn't believe I belonged there, made assumptions about my capabilities based on my skin color. He paused, arranging some papers on his desk. One day, his wife was brought into the emergency room with a ruptured appendix. I was the resident on call. What did you do? Sarah asked softly. I did my job. I performed the surgery that saved her life. After that, he saw me differently. Not because I proved anything, but because he finally looked past his preconceptions and saw me as a human being. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. Like you did with my mother's surgery. Exactly. Dr. Harrison smiled. Sometimes, the best way to fight prejudice is not with anger, but with excellence and compassion. Their conversation was interrupted by an urgent knock. A young nurse burst in. Dr. Harrison, we need you in emergency. Car accident victim, severe chest trauma. He stood up immediately, his demeanor shifting to focused professional mode. I have to go, Mrs. Miller. But remember this, change begins with recognition of our biases. What matters is what we do next. As he rushed out, Sarah remained seated, processing his words. Through the window, she could see the hospital's helicopter pad, where emergency cases arrived daily. She thought about how Dr. Harrison treated each patient with equal care and dignity, regardless of their background. Before leaving his office, Sarah noticed a framed quote on his wall. It read, "The highest form of wisdom is kindness." Below it was a photo of Dr. Harrison with a group of young medical students from diverse backgrounds, all wearing white coats and bright smiles. That evening, as Sarah drove home, she made a decision. Her transformation couldn't stop at just feeling remorse. Like Dr. Harrison said, what mattered was what she did next. She needed to take action, to make real changes in her life and workplace. She pulled into her driveway, her mind already forming plans. The restaurant needed diversity training. She needed to examine and change her own behaviors. Most importantly, she needed to become the kind of person her mother had raised her to be, someone who judged others by their character, not their color. 2 weeks after her mother's surgery, Sarah sat in Thomas Wright's office at the Golden Fork, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had requested this meeting, knowing it might cost her the job she'd held for 15 years. I need to tell you about all the times I've discriminated against customers, she began, her voice steady despite her fear. And then I want to propose some changes. For the next hour, Sarah confessed everything. Every time she had made minority customers wait longer, every excuse she had invented to turn them away, every subtle act of prejudice she had committed. Thomas listened in silence, his expression growing increasingly grave. I'd known about some of this, Sarah, he finally said. I should have addressed it sooner. That's my failure as a manager. I'm not here to blame anyone but myself, Sarah replied. But I want to make it right. I've been doing research, and I have some suggestions for how we can make the Golden Fork truly welcoming to everyone. She pulled out a folder containing diversity training programs, hiring recommendations, and community outreach initiatives. She had spent the past week putting it together, drawing inspiration from her observations at the hospital. This will require significant changes, Thomas said, reviewing the materials. Are you prepared for that? Yes, Sarah answered without hesitation, and I'm willing to share my story as part of the training. Sometimes the best lessons come from acknowledging our mistakes. To Sarah's surprise, Thomas agreed to implement her suggestions. More surprisingly, he asked her to lead the initiative, believing her personal transformation would make her message more powerful. That evening, Sarah visited her mother, who was recovering well at home. She found Dr. Harrison there, doing a follow-up check. Dr. Harrison, Sarah said after he finished examining her mother, I took your advice about actions speaking louder than words. I'd like to tell you what I'm doing. She explained about her meeting with Thomas, the new initiatives at the restaurant, and her commitment to change. Dr. Harrison listened attentively, nodding occasionally. That's commendable, Mrs. Miller, he said when she finished. Change isn't easy, but it's always possible. I've been wondering, Sarah said hesitantly, would you consider coming to speak at one of our training sessions? Your perspective would be invaluable. Dr. Harrison considered for a moment. I'll do better than that. Why don't you bring your staff to the hospital? Let them see what happens when people of all backgrounds work together to save lives. Sometimes seeing is believing. Sarah's eyes lit up at the suggestion. That would be amazing. Patricia, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. James, Dr. Harrison, would you and your family join us for dinner this Sunday? I make a mean pot roast. Dr. Harrison smiled. We'd be honored, Mrs. Anderson. After we left, Patricia turned to her daughter. I'm proud of you, Sarah. Real change takes courage. I learned it from you, Mom, Sarah replied, hugging her mother carefully, mindful of her healing chest. And from Dr. Harrison. The next day at work, Sarah noticed a young black couple hesitating at the restaurant's entrance. In the past, she might have found an excuse to turn them away. Instead, she walked over with a genuine smile. Welcome to the Golden Fork, she said warmly, opening the door. Would you like a table by the window? The sunset view is beautiful from there. The couple seemed surprised by her warmth but followed her to the table. As Sarah handed them their menus, she noticed the woman was wearing a medical student's pin. Are you studying at Atlanta General? Sarah asked. Yes, the woman replied. I'm hoping to specialize in cardiology. Dr. Harrison is actually my mentor. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she thought about how close she had come to turning away this future doctor. You're in good hands, she said softly. Dr. Harrison is an amazing teacher. Later that evening, Michael approached her. I saw how you handled things today, he said. It's different. I'm different, Sarah replied, or at least, I'm trying to be. As she watched the young couple enjoying their meal, Sarah realized that change wasn't just about big gestures or formal programs. It was about the small decisions we make every day, the way we choose to treat each person we meet, and the courage to admit when we've been wrong. 1 year after Patricia Anderson's heart surgery, the Golden Fork looked very different. The restaurant had become known not just for its excellent food, but for its inclusive atmosphere and diverse staff. Sarah, now the restaurant's director of community relations, had transformed from someone who turned people away to someone who brought people together. On this particular evening, the restaurant was hosting a special event. Tables had been pushed aside to create space for a gathering that would have been unimaginable a year ago. The occasion was a fundraiser for Dr. Harrison's Medical Scholarship Foundation, and the Golden Fork had donated the venue and food. Sarah stood near the entrance, watching the diverse crowd of doctors, nurses, business leaders, and community members mingling together. Her mother Patricia sat at a table with Dr. Harrison's wife Lisa, the two women chatting like old friends. Their families had grown close over the past year, sharing Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations. Hard to believe this is the same place, Michael said, now the head server, as he passed by with a tray of appetizers. Sarah smiled, remembering how different things had been. The diversity training program she had implemented had transformed the restaurant's culture. New hiring practices had created opportunities for people from all backgrounds. The Golden Fork had even started a program offering internships to students from underprivileged communities interested in restaurant management. Dr. Harrison approached the podium to address the crowd. A year ago, he began, I walked into this restaurant and was turned away. Today, I stand here celebrating how one person's change of heart led to changing an entire community. Sarah felt tears in her eyes as he continued. Mrs. Sarah Miller taught us all an important lesson, he said, gesturing toward her. She showed us that it's never too late to confront our prejudices and choose a different path. Thanks to her courage in admitting her mistakes and working to correct them, the Golden Fork has become a model for other businesses in Atlanta. The crowd applauded, and Sarah noticed several of her regular customers nodding in agreement. The restaurant's transformation had inspired other establishments to examine their own practices. Later in the evening, Sarah's daughter Emma arrived with her friend Keisha. Both girls were now volunteering at Dr. Harrison's free clinic, inspired by the changes they had witnessed. Mom, Emma said, hugging Sarah, Keisha got accepted to pre-med at Emory. Dr. Harrison wrote her recommendation letter. Sarah hugged Keisha warmly. You'll be an amazing doctor, sweetheart. As the evening wound down, Sarah found herself standing with Dr. Harrison on the restaurant's balcony, looking out over the Atlanta skyline. "You know," he said, "when I first met you, I never imagined we'd be here." "Neither did I," Sarah admitted. "I was so wrong about so many things. We all have our journeys, Mrs. Miller. What matters is where they lead us." He paused, looking at her thoughtfully. "Your mother's heart is still going strong." "Thanks to you," Sarah replied. "No." Dr. Harrison shook his head. "Thanks to science, medicine, and a team of dedicated professionals who don't see color when they look at their patients or their colleagues." Inside, the guests were starting to leave. Sarah could see her mother helping Dr. Harrison's youngest daughter with her coat, while Lisa chatted with Thomas about the restaurant's next community initiative. Sometimes, Dr. Harrison said quietly, "A heart needs to be broken open to let the light in. Your mother's heart surgery broke open your old ways of thinking, and look what grew from that." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The past year had taught her that change was possible, that prejudice could be overcome, and that the human heart, both literally and figuratively, had an amazing capacity for healing and growth. As they walked back inside, Sarah paused to look around the restaurant. The Golden Fork's walls now displayed artwork from local artists of all backgrounds. The staff reflected the diversity of their city. Most importantly, every person who walked through their doors was welcomed with genuine warmth and respect. "Ready to go home?" Patricia asked, approaching with her coat. "Yes," Sarah replied, looking around one last time. "But we're coming back tomorrow. We have work to do." Because that was the most important lesson Sarah had learned. The work of changing hearts and minds never really ended. It continued each day, with each choice, each interaction, each opportunity to see people for who they truly were rather than what they looked like. And Sarah was ready to do that work, one heart at a time, for the rest of her life.